The TBF Avenger bores in at 50 feet. So low the propeller wash kicks spray off the wave tops. Ahead, the Japanese cruiser fills the windscreen, her anti-aircraft batteries already winking orange. The pilot holds course, thumb hovering over the torpedo release, knowing the mathematics of this attack. At this altitude, at this speed, he has perhaps 8 seconds of exposure to concentrated defensive fire. The cruiser's gunners have been practicing for exactly this moment. Tracers reach out in lazy arcs that become screaming lines of death as they converge on the lumbering torpedo bomber. The Avenger shudders as rounds punch through the wing root. Oil pressure drops. The pilot releases anyway, feels the aircraft lurch upward as the torpedo falls away, then hauls back on the stick to escape. He never makes it. The starboard wing folds. Fuel ignites, and the Avenger cartwheels into the Pacific. His wingman, watching from 200 yards behind, knows he is next. The fighter escort that was supposed to suppress those guns turned back 20 minutes ago. Their fighters couldn't keep pace with the strike group's fuel consumption. And staying meant ditching an open ocean. The torpedo bombers went in alone. They always go in alone now. If you're finding this story gripping, hit subscribe. I'm Jason, and here on WW2 with Jason, we dig into the forgotten aircraft and impossible problems of the Second World War. Now, back to the Pacific, where American naval aviators are dying faster than the Navy can replace them. The mathematics of slaughter. The waters around Guadalcanal have become a killing ground, and by February 1943, American naval aviation is hemorrhaging aircraft and aircrew at rates that threaten to collapse the entire Pacific offensive. The problem is not courage. Marine and Navy pilots have proven their willingness to press attacks into the teeth of enemy fire. The problem is equipment. The aircraft they fly cannot do what the Pacific War demands. The Grumman carrier fighter represents everything American carrier aviation has available, and it is not enough. American carrier fighters are tough. Their armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks bringing pilots home with damage that would have killed them in any other fighter. But toughness is a defensive virtue. In the skies above the Solomon Islands, where Japanese fighters hunt in pairs and divisions, the American fighters' limitations have become a death sentence for pilots who forget them. Enemy fighters climb at nearly 3,000 feet per minute. American carrier fighters manage barely 2,000. Japanese fighters turn inside any American fighter with contemptuous ease. Their lightweight construction and massive wing area, giving enemy pilots a maneuvering advantage that cannot be overcome through skill alone. American pilots who attempt to dogfight enemy fighters, who try to match turn for turn, climb for climb, simply disappear. Their squadrons list them as missing in action. Defensive weaving tactics have saved lives. The scissoring maneuver allowing paired fighters to protect each other's tails when enemy aircraft attack. But the thatch weave is a survival tactic, not a victory tactic. It keeps pilots alive long enough to escape. It does not allow them to pursue, to hunt, to destroy. Japanese pilots have learned to recognize the weave and simply wait for American fighters to exhaust their fuel or make a mistake. The mathematics favor patience when you hold the performance advantage. Carrier air group commanders watch their fighter strength erode mission by mission. Replacement pilots arrive from stateside training with adequate stick time, but no understanding of the Pacific's brutal realities. They learn fast or they die fast. Most die fast. The veterans who survive do so by internalizing rules that would have seemed cowardly in peacetime. Never turn with an enemy fighter. Never climb after an enemy fighter. Never follow an enemy fighter into a cloud. Attack from above. Make one pass. Dive away at maximum speed. If you cannot set up that attack, do not engage at all. These rules preserve pilots. They do not win air superiority. The Army Air Forces contribute what they can, but their fighters fare no better. The mid-engine fighter, with its mid-mounted engine and tricycle landing gear, looks modern but flies like a compromise. The engine placement that allows a nose-mounted 37mm cannon also makes the aircraft dangerously nose-heavy in steep dives. Pilots who push this fighter too hard in combat find themselves in unrecoverable tumbles. Above 15,000 feet, where the supercharger cannot maintain manifold pressure, the aircraft becomes sluggish and vulnerable. Japanese pilots have learned to drag these fighters upward, climbing until the American fighters wallow helplessly, then rolling over for easy kills. The inline engine fighter offers better diving performance. In a vertical plunge, it can outrun anything in the Pacific theater, but this fighter cannot climb. Its Allison engine, designed for low-altitude performance, gasps for air above 20,000 feet. Enemy pilots operating at altitude simply refuse to engage these fighters below them. They wait, circling, until the American fighters must climb to attack bombers or protect friendly aircraft. Then they pounce. The dive speed means nothing when the enemy chooses never to let you dive. Marine squadrons at Henderson Field have developed tactics that maximize their inferior equipment, but tactics cannot overcome physics. Fighter sweeps that should clear the skies of Japanese aircraft instead become desperate defensive actions. Escort missions that should protect bombers instead become sacrificial delays. American fighters engaging enemy fighters just long enough for the strike aircraft to reach their targets before the fighters are overwhelmed. The bombers go in without cover. The bombers die. Carrier task force commanders face an impossible operational calculus. Every strike mission requires fighter escort. Fighter escort requires carrier fighters. Carrier fighters cannot keep pace with strike groups over long distances without exhausting their fuel reserves. Extending range means adding drop tanks, which degrade performance and must be jettisoned before combat. Jettisoned drop tanks mean fighters that cannot make it back to their carriers. The Navy is losing aircraft to fuel exhaustion almost as fast as it loses them to enemy action. South Pacific Air Commanders send increasingly urgent messages to Washington. See, fighter squadrons are combat ineffective. Replacement aircraft arrive, but they are more of the same inadequate machines that are already dying over the Solomons. The commanders need something that can fight enemy fighters on equal terms. They need something that can escort strike groups to distant targets and still have fuel to fight. They need something that does not yet exist in their theater. The Bureau of Aeronautics responds with promises. New fighters are coming. Better fighters. Fighters that will change everything. But the new fighters are not here now. And pilots are dying now. Staff officers calculate loss rates and project forward. At current attrition, fighter squadrons will cease to exist as effective combat units within 90 days. The Japanese will own the skies over the Solomons. The Marines on Guadalcanal will lose their air cover. The entire offensive will stall. Naval aviation procurement has failed to anticipate the Pacific War's demands. Pre-war planning assumed carrier fighters would primarily defend the fleet against enemy bombers, a mission that emphasized climb rate and ceiling over range and speed. American carrier fighters were designed for that mission. They were never designed to escort strike groups across hundreds of miles of ocean, engage enemy fighters, and return. They were never designed to achieve air superiority over contested islands. They were designed for a war that no longer exists. The Japanese have noticed. Intelligence reports compiled from prisoner interrogations and captured documents reveal a disturbing confidence among enemy pilots. They know American fighters cannot match them above 20,000 feet. They know carrier fighters cannot pursue them in a climb. They have learned to exploit every American weakness with systematic precision. Enemy pilots now operate with tactical doctrines specifically designed to defeat American equipment. They climb to altitude before engaging, forcing American fighters to come up to them. They extend horizontally when American fighters dive. Knowing the existing fighters cannot sustain pursuit, they concentrate attacks on damaged aircraft, knowing American pilots will try to protect their wounded wingmen. They have transformed American courage into American vulnerability. Japanese naval air commanders have begun rotating their most experienced pilots through the Solomons specifically to teach these tactics to newer aviators. The Americans are providing live training targets. Every engagement reinforces Japanese confidence and erodes American morale. Pilots who survive multiple missions develop the 1,000-yard stare of men who know their odds. Pilots who do not survive become statistics and after-action reports that no one in Washington wants to read. The fleet needs a fighter that can climb with enemy fighters. It needs a fighter that can dive faster than anything flying. It needs a fighter that can absorb punishment and keep fighting. It needs a fighter with range enough to escort strikes and firepower enough to kill with a single burst. It needs a fighter that can operate from carrier decks, that can survive the brutal stress of catapult launches and arrested landings, that can be maintained by exhausted deck crews working around the clock. The fleet needs something that does not exist, but somewhere in the pipeline, something is coming. Test pilots at Patuxent River have been ringing out a new design, a fighter unlike anything the Navy has ever operated. Carrier qualification trials have revealed problems: loss of visibility over the nose, dangerous stall characteristics, a landing gear that bounces on deck. Engineers are working the problems. Production lines are tooling up. Training squadrons are forming. The Japanese do not know this. They see only the carrier fighters they have learned to defeat, the inline engine fighters they have learned to avoid, the mid-engine fighters they have learned to drag into the death zone above 15,000 feet. They see American naval aviation struggling, bleeding, failing. They see an enemy they have measured and found wanting. It's the aircraft sat at Henderson Field's dispersal area looking like nothing the Marine pilots had ever seen. Its silhouette was wrong. The wings bent downward from the fuselage before sweeping back up, creating an inverted gull shape that seemed to defy conventional fighter design. The nose stretched impossibly far forward, housing an engine cowling so massive it blocked any view of the runway ahead when the tail was down. Ground crew walked around it with expressions mixing curiosity and skepticism. The thing looked fast, certainly, but also ungainly, almost awkward sitting there in the tropical mud with its long landing gear legs splayed wide. Pilots from VMF 124 approached their new mounts with the wariness of men who had learned hard lessons about trusting unfamiliar machinery in combat. The aircraft dwarfed the fighters they had been flying. Where the Grumman fighter had been compact and stubby, this new machine was all length and power, its three-bladed propellers so large it seemed designed for a bomber. The cockpit sat far back along the fuselage, perched high above those bent wings, and when pilots climbed up to inspect the interior, they found an instrument panel crammed with gauges and a control stick that felt heavier than anything they had handled before. Some shook their heads. Others ran their hands along the cowling and felt the heat still radiating from the massive radial engine within. Whatever this thing was, it promised either salvation or disaster. Nothing in between. The Vought F-4U Corsair had arrived in the Pacific Theater, and with it came specifications that redefined what American pilots could expect from a single-engine fighter. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, making it the most powerful power plant ever fitted to a production fighter aircraft. Maximum speed exceeded 446 miles per hour at altitude, with a service ceiling above 36,000 feet. Rate of climb approached 3,000 feet per minute in clean configuration. The inverted gull wing that gave the Corsair its distinctive appearance served pure engineering necessity. It allowed the shortest possible landing gear legs while still providing clearance for the 13-foot 2-inch propeller, the largest ever fitted to a fighter. A 650 caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun delivered firepower that could shred any Japanese aircraft in seconds. Range exceeded 1,000 miles with internal fuel, extendable with drop tanks for the long overwater missions Pacific combat demanded. The aircraft represented everything American industrial might could produce when engineers were told to build the fastest, most powerful fighter possible. VMF 124's early engagements saw mixed results. Operational records suggest several aircraft lost against limited claims in the initial weeks. The results revealed that pilots attempting traditional dogfighting maneuvers against more agile Japanese fighters still found themselves in trouble. The Corsair could not turn with a zero at low speed, and pilots who tried discovered the hard way that superior horsepower meant nothing in a slow-speed scissors fight. But those who survived learned quickly. The boom and zoom tactics that emerged from these early bloody lessons transformed American fighter doctrine across the Pacific. Pilots would use the Corsair's superior climb rate to gain altitude advantage, then dive through Japanese formations at speeds no zero could match, firing brief devastating bursts before using excess speed to climb back to safety. Japanese pilots found themselves unable to pursue or escape. The aircraft that seemed so awkward on the ground became a predator in its element, dictating the terms of every engagement. The Solomons campaign through 1943 provided the proving ground where Corsair tactics matured. Odds Marine squadrons operating from forward bases accumulated exceptional unit scores during this period. Operational records from this period indicate kill ratios that would have seemed fantasy during the dark days of 1942. The fighter sweep missions over Rabaul in late 1943 and early 1944 saw Corsair squadrons engaging Japanese interceptors over their own airfields, a reversal of fortune that demonstrated how completely air superiority had shifted. Japanese pilots began reporting the distinctive whistling sound the Corsair made in high-speed dives, a phenomenon caused by air flowing through the wing root oil cooler intakes, and the nickname Whistling Death entered Pacific war legend. By the time the Marianas campaign commenced in June 1944, MACE Corsair squadrons operating from captured island bases had established complete dominance over Japanese aviation in the Central Pacific. the aircraft's limitations remained real despite its combat success. The long nose that housed that massive engine created severe visibility problems during carrier landing approaches, and the stiff oleo struts in the landing gear caused dangerous bouncing on deck that could send aircraft over the side or into the barrier. The Navy's initial rejection of the Corsair for carrier operations was not timidity but hard-learned wisdom about what deck landing demanded. Pilots transitioning from earlier fighters found the Corsair's stall characteristics unforgiving, with little warning before the wing dropped sharply. Engine torque on takeoff required constant rudder correction, and inexperienced pilots who relaxed attention during the critical moments after leaving the ground sometimes found themselves in uncontrollable rolls. The cockpit ran hot in tropical conditions, and the greenhouse canopy that provided excellent visibility also turned the interior into an oven during ground operations. Maintenance crews struggled with the complexity of the R2800 engine in forward area conditions, and parts availability remained problematic throughout 1943. The Corsair eventually conquered its carrier demons through modified approach techniques and landing gear improvements, joining fleet operations aboard Essex-class carriers in late 1944. The fighter-bomber role emerged as equally important as air superiority work, with Corsairs carrying bombs and rockets against Japanese ground positions across the Pacific. Okinawa in 1945 saw Corsairs flying constant close air support missions, their heavy armament and ability to absorb battle damage making them ideal for the dangerous low-altitude work over contested beaches. Production across Vought, Goodyear, and Brewster factories exceeded 12,000 aircraft in multiple variants, making the Corsair one of the most produced American fighters of the war. The bent-wing fighter's service extended far beyond VJ Day. Corsairs flew combat missions over Korea, where they proved equally effective against North Korean and Chinese forces. The French Aeronavale operated Corsairs in Indochina, and the type remained in production until 1953. The last piston-engine fighter manufactured for American military service. Several nations continued operating Corsairs into the 1960s. It is testament to the fundamental soundness of the design. Today, airworthy Corsairs remain among the most prized warbirds at air shows worldwide, their distinctive whistling approach still turning heads 70 years after they first terrorized Japanese pilots over the Solomons. The Corsair answered the desperate question that had haunted American pilots since Pearl Harbor. Against an enemy whose fighters could outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver anything America initially fielded, the solution was not to match Japanese agility, but to render it irrelevant. Speed, firepower, and the discipline to fight on American terms rather than Japanese terms transformed the Pacific Air War. The bent wing that looked so strange on the ground proved aerodynamically brilliant in combat, and the pilots who mastered the Corsair's demanding character found themselves flying the most feared fighter in the Pacific theater. The whistling death that Japanese pilots learned to dread had earned every syllable of its fearsome name.